walked into the kitchen, an acrid smell filled my nostrils. The odor of burning plastic marked the end of the blob of flour, water, and bacteria I had been painstakingly feeding daily for 2 years. My sourdough starter. At the beginning of COVID, I moved back into my parents' house for a time when my organizing job went fully remote. It was the first time in over a decade that all 4 members of my nuclear family were all under one roof. As you can imagine, it wasn't the smoothest of times. I looked for ways to focus my energy into something for myself. On Twitter one day, I came across a thread with instructions for beginning a sourdough starter. I figured, why not? I went into the kitchen, picked out a jar, measured out 5 tablespoons of flour, 3 tablespoons of water, and named it Willis. I followed the instructions to a T, day after day, feeding Willis. After a few weeks, he passed the float test. Willis was ready to bake. I made my first loaf. It wasn't great. It was a bit frisbee-shaped, didn't quite rise enough. I shared it with my family. They immediately jumped in with feedback. I brushed them off. This was going to be my bread. I was going to figure it out on my own. Willis and I plowed forward month after month. Eventually, I moved here to Western Mass. I took a new job as a community organizer based here in the Valley. I was especially excited about establishing more long-term community in one place after moving regularly over the previous few years. Willis and I moved into a housing cooperative in Greenfield and volunteered to be the bread bakers for the house. I knew I was going to be baking anyway, might as well bake for the rest of my housemates too. Everything went smoothly until that fateful February morning about a year later. Willis had been in the oven overnight with the light on to stay warm on a chilly night. My housemate had turned the oven on to make their breakfast without checking. Willis was toast. The plastic container lid that had been on the jar had melted all over the place. Inside the jar, on the outside, all over the bottom of the oven. My housemates and I scraped the plastic off to make the oven safe for food again, and took the plastic off the edge of the jar to put it on the oven controls as a forever reminder. Check the oven before turning it on. It looked like we had a permanent Halloween decoration of orange drippings on our oven. Once the tragedy of losing Willis had subsided a little bit, I remembered that I had some pretty recent discard in the fridge. I could feed it and have an active starter again in no time. In some ways, Willis was still here. But I knew I had to mark the transition in some way while honoring Willis's legacy. I looked for a new name. Willis. Will isn't. Will are. Won'tus. Won'tus and I jumped into this new chapter of our bread baking together, full throttle. We doubled our production, baking regular loaves for the house on Fridays. On Tuesdays, we looked for recommendations and suggestions from my housemates, asking them what they wanted to eat. Sourdough, garlic knots, pretzels, bagels, focaccia. Beyond our house, I was also baking bread for the broader community. I mailed a loaf to a coworker when she had a baby, mailed bread to a friend of mine when they had surgery. Every potluck that I attended or hosted featured a focaccia or sourdough loaf. Mind you, my bread is good. I'm not imposing bad carbs on everyone in my community. My coworkers specifically request a loaf of mine every time we have a staff retreat as part of our lunch spread. For my housemate's 49th birthday, I made 49 sourdough garlic knots, including 7 in the shape of the letters of his name. Now, as someone who thrives on words of affirmation and who's a community organizer at heart and as a profession, bread baking is the perfect recipe. I get to show care for those around me and build new relationships, nourish other people, and get praise for it. In the 4.5 years since I started Willis in my parents' kitchen, my bread baking has come a long way and expanded to much wider horizons. It's become much more than about how to focus my own energy and more about how to build community with many others. Boy, does it taste sweeter that way.